Muy buenos días. Me ha dado mucho gusto por la mañana encontrarme con el doctor Paul Biemer y nos saludamos con un muy buenos días. El doctor Paul Biemer le gustaría hablar sin micrófono, pero si ustedes consideran que es necesario, entonces lo tomará. Okay. Well, we shall continue with the talk, Adaptive, Responsive and Tailored Design, a call for further research. I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Biemer. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Mathematics and a Master of Science and PhD in Statistics from the Texas and A&M University. He's Distinguished Fellow of Statistics at RTI International and Associate Director of Survey Research and Development at the Autumn Institute, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His areas of expertise include survey design and data analysis, survey management, and the evaluation of the total error in statistical products. He is Fellow of the American Statistical Association, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the International Statistical Institute. So, please.
Good morning, and thank you very much for being here, and also I'd like to thank the organizers for organizing such a great workshop, and especially for inviting me to talk to you this morning. So as you can see from my title, I've added a term that we haven't talked much about in this workshop, which is tailored designs. And so I think maybe I define adaptive designs a little differently than our earlier speakers do. But I think of adaptive designs as being activities during data collection that actually change from the original design, sort of adapts the design to what the paradata and the metrics that are derived from the paradata are telling you about outcomes. Whereas tailored designs are, I think of those as being, maybe during the design stage of the survey, you may decide that you're going to be using certain protocols for certain subgroups, and that may not be, and you can also maybe adapt that during the data collection, but that's kind of like a pre-designed decisions that are being made. And so together we talk about adaptive, responsive, and tailored designs, which I give the acronym ART, because after all, survey methodology is as much an art as a science, right? So it kind of fits. But in addition, I think that these terms can be useful when we're talking with one another and trying to communicate in terms of whether we're going to be doing responsive design, adaptive design, or some sort of tailoring in our data collection. But when it really comes, and I think we're all talking about the same body or collection of techniques and methodologies, but when we're actually engaged in doing these things, as we were talking about yesterday, I think Andy mentioned that we start out with a set of objectives, and we're using whatever techniques and methodologies and approaches that will achieve our objectives. And we're really not thinking about whether we're going to be using a responsive design or adaptive design. We're thinking in terms of the techniques that are involved there. So I'm going to be talking, I'm going to be giving you initially sort of some background and what I view as sort of an evolution of that methodology from the early days back when I started in the 70s. But then I'm sort of going to then leave those terms, and I'm not going to refer to them anymore, because really what this talk is about is the methodologies and the approaches and the techniques that we've developed within this collection, or this embodied in this methodology that I call the ART design. So if you think about where we were, and I see from the audience there's not many of you maybe that were around back in the 70s and 80s, or maybe there are a few of you. The field work back then was very different than it is today, because it was mainly based on paper. Even then, however, there was some adaptive design going on to the extent that we could obtain data from the field. In a lot of cases, this was just sort of number of visits, call records, as we heard Gabby talk about, those kinds of things, very sort of rudimentary types of paradata that were being collected at that time. But nevertheless, we would be able to make, based upon this paradata, derive metrics which then could be used to project outcomes for that survey. And if we didn't like the outcomes, we could do some interventions to try to change things. For example, we may hire more interviewers, we may do more interviewer training, we may give feedback to the interviewers. There's a whole bunch of things that we do. So even back then, I think we were doing adaptive design. Now, if you think about what we're doing today, of course, there's a lot more information that's being gathered on computers. We have CAPI, we have ACASI, we have online surveys, we have automated systems that are generating telephone surveys and so forth. And so there's a wealth of information available to us to do a much better job at monitoring the field work. But some of the techniques that we've been talking about, I'm sure those of you who are engaged in actually conducting surveys are probably doing adaptive design without ever even calling it adaptive design. If you're obtaining paradata from the field, this could be even call records. You're developing some kind of a metric, for example, how many calls have been made to this particular household, or which households have not received as many calls as they should. Are there certain aspects that are underworked, that kind of thing. And then you're making changes in the field on the basis of that information. You're doing what I would call adaptive design. It doesn't have to be any particular fancy techniques associated with it. So if we go back into the pre-AD, pre-adaptive design days, we find that we were doing adaptive design, but in a cruder way. Leading to that, there was I think a change once we started to gather more information through the computer-assisted interviewing methodologies. We found that we could do a much better job at predicting outcomes for surveys. We were still doing experimental designs to be able to test different methodologies, but it wasn't responsive design in the sense that those experimental designs were usually embedded in some kind of a pilot or a pre-test. And then there was a period after that where we analyzed the data, and then we went forward on the main data collection, basing the methodology in the main data collection off of what we learned in that experiment. What was sort of novel is what came with the Groves-Haringa paper, where they sort of merged that experimental phase in with the main data collection, so there wasn't a gap any longer. There wasn't a period where you would pause, analyze the experimental data, and then figure out which treatment worked best, and then begin the main data collection stage. What they did basically was merge that into sort of one data collection. They called it phase one. So it was an experimental phase where the trick was, however, to predict the outcome of an experiment before you actually had all the data from the experiment, because you had to then lead right into the main data collection without any pause to really analyze it. So part of the difficulty with responsive design is being able to project outcomes from experiments that you might be conducting in that phase one. You may be conducting in phase one before you actually completed the experiment. And they were able to do that with a lot of the paradata and so forth that is available now through computer automation. So responsive design is what's important about it is that and they had to do this because of the survey they were working on. The National Survey of Family Growth required them to not only use that experimental data in the estimate, so they weren't going to throw that away. That experimental data became part of the National Survey of Family Growth's estimates. But they also didn't have the time frame to be able to do an experiment, pause, and then start data collection again. And it's expensive to do that because you might lose interviewers in that period. Could be 2 or 3 months when you're analyzing the data. So responsive design was an important innovation that way. There were other innovations that came out of responsive design. For example, the whole idea of phases and having this end phase where you're doing non-response follow-up, possibly on a subsample. And from that you can see where other sort of tailored, what I would say that Barry Schouten's work, a lot of it is on the lines of a tailored design in terms of identifying modes that work best for certain subgroups and building that into the design to be able to switch to those modes in a seamless way. But also part of the adaptive design could be rethinking that and actually deciding to use different modes based upon the data that you're collecting in a more contemporary fashion, so that you don't, these may not be pre-decided, but they may be decided during the actual data collection. But nevertheless, I like the term tailor design for that type of methodology because it distinguishes a little from what we actually do with adaptive design, which, you know, when you go to have a suit made for you, you're having it tailored to specifically for your body. But if you have a suit adapted, it could be someone else's suit that you're trying to adapt to your own body. So having a tailor design means that you're actually designing that survey at the beginning to identify, you know, which protocols work best within certain segments of the population. Whereas adaptive is more of deciding it on the fly, maybe having a lot of options to be able to choose during that process, but nevertheless reading the paradata, reading the metrics, and making decisions on the fly. And then finally we come to adaptive total design, which is where I would like to think that, you know, we're doing it more broadly across a lot of different sources of error. So whereas we've been talking a lot about increasing response rates and trying to contain cost or control cost, and I think we also mentioned that there are some objectives to try to even, you know, look at sampling error and maybe even look at frame error. Adaptive total design formalizes that and tries to look at multiple error sources simultaneously, because what we find in some situations where we're trying to, say, for example, increase response rates, as it could have a detrimental effect, unintended consequence on other sources of error. For example, measurement error might increase as you begin to push towards getting more and more response. Interviewers might take shortcuts, for example. You might have greater interviewer error. There are things like that that can occur once you start putting pressure on higher response rates. And what adaptive total design tries to do is to look at a broader spectrum of error sources to see whether there are these unintended consequences, or the way I like to describe it is to look at interactions between error sources. If I increase this metric, is it going to have a detrimental effect on this metric? So I need to look at those simultaneously. So here's, you know, a table that I put together for my way of thinking about what these different terms mean in terms of the defining features that are listed in the first column. And I'll let you read that, but if you can see, you know, if you go down to the last column on ATD, you see that what I think, the way it differs, some might disagree, is that it monitors all major error sources. It tries to monitor the interaction effects across error sources, like, again, the unintended consequences. And one thing I didn't mention in the previous slides was that we try to use process control in distinguishing between common and special causes. Now, what I mean by that is, if we're looking at some metrics over time, and this is quite common when we are doing art designs, we're looking at a time series of metrics, and you'll see changes in those metrics, but those changes may not be real. That may be just random variation. And it would be a mistake to take some action on the basis of that if it is random variation, because all you're going to do is cause more random variation. So you want to hold back and not intervene until you know that the change is actually indicating some real change in the system and not some sort of random event. And that's the difference between common cause variation, which are these random things that would cause, say, response rates to sort of jiggle over time, versus a special cause, which actually means there's something going on that's changing the response rate. This is not something that's just sort of common or random. This is something that is real, that we need to intervene and we need to address with an intervention. And so I haven't heard much talk about that, but I think this is a very important part of art design, is that we distinguish between common and special cause variation, because otherwise you could be misled and making interventions that are really not necessary and actually do more harm than good. So the rest of the talk, I'm going to sort of leave the terminology that we've just discussed behind, and I really want to just talk about some of the major research domains or streams that I find, if we look across the last couple of decades, for example, what are some of the major innovations and developments in the field of art design? And more importantly, what are some of the gaps that we need to fill? Because what we're really interested in is, using what we've developed so far, but we also want to go to the next level. We want to actually make these methods more effective, use Paradata more effective ways, have better prediction models, have better interventions, have better training for interviewers and for survey staff and so forth, so that we can really bring this to the next level and make this a very, very powerful approach to conducting surveys. And so I've identified these major research streams that I'm going to go through now and talk about a bit. I don't have time to really spend much time on any one of them, but I hope you get the gist of sort of what the development was and then where I think we need to go in terms of new developments. So let's talk about number one, which is this idea of the response propensity model, or some sort of propensity model. It doesn't have to be response propensity. So I denote that as rho, and then I use the slash to make a condition. So this is a conditional response propensity based upon some characteristics x. And x is sort of the auxiliary data, or some sort of paradata. It could be paradata, it could be auxiliary data, it could be characteristics of households and so forth. I distinguish between X and Y. Y are actually the outcomes. These are questionnaire data. So we think about data that's being collected in the questionnaire. Those are our Y values. Those are our outcomes. And we use X because we don't know the Ys, right? The Ys are being collected in the questionnaire. We don't have them ahead of time. But we use X because we think X is highly correlated with Y, so that if we can read what's happening with the X's, it may give us an inkling of what's happening with the Y's. So the propensity given X's is sort of telling us sort of what's the propensity given the Y's. That's how we're using it. And if X doesn't predict Y very well, then we're not going to do a very good job. So one question is, which propensity are we talking about? So you think about response propensity. Let's just deal with response propensity. Every individual you could think about or postulate that every individual in the sample has an initial propensity, which will change, you hope, if it's a low propensity, you hope that propensity will change as you do follow-up. So you may contact them once and they refuse, but through multiple contacts, you hope that they will respond. What you're trying to do is change their propensity. So there's an initial propensity and there's the final propensity. And so sometimes we're not very clear on what we're talking about there. I think a lot of times what we try to do in adaptive design and art designs in general is that we're trying to predict their initial propensities so that we can change, so we can adapt to, if they have a very low initial propensity, use some kind of other protocol that would have a higher propensity. So their propensity is low for this particular protocol, but it could be higher for that protocol. So let's switch and use this protocol. So it's the initial propensity that we're dealing with. But when we do the final weighting that we're doing at the end of the survey, we have to weight the data, we have to do non-response adjustments, it's based upon the final propensity. So we have to think in terms of which propensity, and there's also other propensities like contact, the propensity of being contacted versus the propensity of cooperating once you have contacted them, the propensity of giving you a true answer given that they're cooperating. All of these propensities, I think it's kind of a blur. So I think we need to be a little more exacting about our language in terms of what we're talking about. And then, of course, there's prior data that we can use to estimate these propensities, and then the possibility of using Bayesian statistics, and Enrico would be very happy to hear that term. He's not here this morning, but anyway, using Bayesian statistics to try to, as I show here, to try to blend new data that you're collecting on what are the outcomes from our current data collection, and update your estimates based upon the old data, based upon the new data. You're not going to throw away the old data, but eventually you're going to be weighting more and more towards the current data, and that's a common technique in the way that we try to update our propensities as we move data collection forward and doing adaptive design to try to get better information about what methods would work best for what population members. Now, in terms of applications, part of the application is trying to do a good job, having a good model to try to estimate the response propensities, right? But even if, and I think we do a pretty good job in the field, if we have enough data to be able to do that, at least in my experience, I'm dealing with a lot of panel surveys. It's seems to be a lot of surveys that I deal with are panel surveys. And with panel surveys, we have a history of these respondents and how they've responded in the past. And so we can develop pretty good models about whether they're going to respond on this wave, given what they've done on prior waves. So the more information you have, and a panel survey is an ideal situation, the better you can predict how someone will respond to the next round for the next contact, or are they going to be difficult to contact, given that you've contacted them, are going to be difficult to convince to do the survey. But let's suppose that you knew these rows exactly. In other words, you knew that their probability of being a respondent, given that you've contacted them, is like 0.3. We knew that exactly. So there's a 30% chance that they will respond, cooperate. What would you do with that information? Well, that's the harder part, I think. The harder part is, how do you change that? How do you manipulate those row values to increase them, primarily to increase them? No one wants to really lower them. We want to increase them. So it's those interventions that are the real stickler here. If you knew these propensities exactly, you could say, well, I'm going to take all these low propensities and move them up. I want these propensities to be higher. Well, that's easier said than done. So the interventions on how you actually get someone to cooperate who's unwilling to cooperate. Now, we know some techniques like incentives and so forth, but sometimes we're very restrictive on how much we can, use incentives and use these other methodologies. And so that's where I think a lot of research is needed. So, and this even gets more complicated when you think about manipulating these for different subgroups in order to be able to balance the rows, as we've talked about, like with the R indicator and so forth, trying to level out all of the response propensities across all these different subgroups, hoping that that will reduce the bias in the outcome variables, the Y variables. And that brings me to sample balancing. So we know that, and I think this is one of the major developments of our modern time, is that we've been able to identify that, first of all, high response rates do not guarantee a low bias. You can have a bias even if you have 75% response rate. You could still have a significant bias. So, and 75% these days, unfortunately, is pretty high response rate. What seems to matter is the representativity, if you will, of the sample. Is your sample well balanced? Now, if the sample is not well balanced, what I mean by well balanced, does the distribution of those X variables for your sample look like they do for the population? And we'd like that to happen because that means that the weighting that we do later for non-response adjustments doesn't have to work as hard. And I think Barry said yesterday, there's some evidence that if you start out with a fairly balanced, unweighted sample, after you weight, it will have less bias than if you had a very unbalanced sample and you weighted it to try to make it balanced using a weighting adjustment. So we know we are trying to balance the sample, and but I do want to point out that that's not going to guarantee low bias. It all depends upon how you select your X variables. Now, if you have an omnibus survey, say in a survey where you're gathering a lot of different outcomes, it's a health survey, for example, and there's lots of different outcomes that you're collecting. And it could be that some X's work good for these outcomes, other X's work good for these outcomes, but you have a lot of different outcomes here, so that's a lot of X variables to try to balance on. So you have to pick and choose. And so in those situations, the X's may not be ideal. They could be ideal for some outcomes, but not ideal for other outcomes, and so you're going to miss the boat. And this is why, and I'll show you some slides in a few minutes, this is why we try to move towards high response rates. Because high response rates lowers the risk of bias. It's not just about balancing. you can have a low response rate and a very balanced sample and still have a very high bias. Why? Because the X variables don't work for every outcome. There are going to be some outcomes that you collect in your survey that are going to be very biased, despite the fact that it was balanced on these X variables. And if you have a low response rate. So having a high response rate is just another way of protecting against the risk of bias. Balancing is another way of protecting your risk of bias. Neither one of those by themselves will guarantee it, but hopefully if you use multiple approaches, you'll be closer to minimizing the bias. And then there's different ways of balancing. We heard about, using the R indicator to balance the rows, that is the response propensities across different groups, but you could also use the X variables themselves and balance the X variables irrespective of their response rates, just balancing on the X's, making the X's for the sample look like, the distribution for the sample look like the distribution for the population. And there's research that is needed to know which is best, because I think we'll find when you look at the literature, people are using different things. There's the R indicator, but there's also the methods that Lundquist and Sardell are using, which are sample balance indicators, which they claim are better than the R indicators. But both of those deal with unweighted data, and what really matters is what's the bias after you've weighted the data, right? So that's an important, another point that what we're really interested in is what's happening to the bias once in the final published estimates, and those are weighted. And these indicators work on weighted or selection weighted. They don't do any non-response adjustments. Response rate maximization. So there's been a lot of work to try to figure out how we can maximize response rates. Again, as I mentioned to you, I think it's important. The paper by Groves and Pacheva, that, however, kind of dispute that, says the response rates really don't matter much for the bias. You might have seen this slide before, or this graph before. It's out of the Groves-Pacheva paper, and we heard that, Turango, I think Young said that Turango and his colleagues reanalyzed these data, and really this is a very simplistic view, but what it shows is basically as I increase response rates, I can get high bias for low response rates, I can get high bias for high response rates. It doesn't seem like the response rate has much effect. And in fact, in their paper, they say the response rate is a poor indicator, it's a poor predictor of the bias in its various estimates, which is true. It doesn't predict the bias very well. But I would suggest that it does predict the risk of bias. And here's the same data, and what we did here basically is just fit a very different model. What we did is to look at the variance of the biases. So if you go back to this slide, those dots at each point on the x-axis, there's a column of dots. And if you look at the variance of those dots, okay, what you find is that as the non-response rate goes up, the variance of those dots gets larger. Now, what does that mean when the variance of those dots? That means that that you have more items. Every one of those dots is an item on the questionnaire. And when you have high non-response, that means you have the possibility, a greater chance that some of those characteristics you're measuring in your survey are going to have high bias. It doesn't mean that the bias for any one of them is going to be high. What it means is that your chances that some are going to be high is increased as non-response goes up. So that's why I would suggest that response rates matter, and that one should not just be fixated on the balance, but also on the response rate, because that's one way. If you got if you could get a 90% response rate, you wouldn't have to worry much about the bias on any item in your questionnaire, unless you had item non-response, of course. But how do you maximize response rates? Well, there's only a few ways that we know how to do that. You can continue to contact them. We heard Gabby say that at some point, there's a point of diminishing returns where contacting is not going to yield much anymore. So you can only contact people so many times, or attempt to contact them. So what we do is we attempt to contact them, we're not getting them. Once you contacted them, there may be a refusal, and then you may only have one more shot, because you might have one refusal conversion opportunity to try to convert them. But the whole point there is just what are strategies that are very effective in trying to reach people and contact them, particularly if you're not out on the field, knocking on doors, but you're trying to do it on the telephone or you're trying to do it by mail, those kinds of things. Very, very difficult to try to manipulate that. There's incentives, which again, they work pretty well if they can be advanced incentives, but delivering an incentive prior to them actually doing a survey is difficult. Promise incentives don't work as well. And then of course the amount, there's a lot of literature on, and that can vary a lot depending upon the populations. More effective interviewing methods, different modes. And then of course two-phase sampling is this is an old idea that was developed by Hansen and his colleagues years ago, which was sort of brought to life by the Groves-Haringa paper where they started to do two-phase sampling. We're now getting much better at two-phase sampling because one of the negatives about two-phase sampling was the increase in the variance due to unequal weighting effects. We're learning how to minimize those unequal weighting effects, and so you can actually have two-phase sampling without increasing the unequal weighting effects. And so, but there's more research needed there. And then I also believe that selected case substitution, actually substituting cases, when you have administrative data or frames now are becoming very, very full of information, sampling frames. We use directory, the Postal Service frames in the US for a lot of our sampling, and they're companies that merge a lot of information on these addresses, so there's lots of information that can be used. And they can be used to model propensities, but they can also be used to try to identify individuals who are very similar to the individual that you sampled, and basically if this individual you sampled is a non-respondent, to substitute that individual. Now this is a very common thing to do when you're talking about primary sampling units. For example, we've been substituting schools. If you're doing a school survey, or you're doing, we use also some business establishments as a primary sampling unit, or other institutions. You can, using a similar institution, when an institution refuses to cooperate for your survey, using a similar institution to substitute for them is a common thing to do in a lot of surveys. But it's not so common to do that at the individual level, at this household level or the person level. I think some research could be done here to actually make that very worthwhile. A fourth stream is metric visualization, and this is one of the visuals that we have in the system that Joe Murphy has developed at RTI for the adaptive total design. It's a dashboard, but remember I told you that it's important to look at multiple error sources simultaneously, or to look at interaction effects. So if I'm going to increase this metric, for example, the response rate, if I'm going to try to really pressure interviewers to try to get the response rates up, what happens if the interviewers start taking shortcuts? How do I control the measurement error associated with interviewer error and other types of errors? Dashboards provide one opportunity to sort of visualize those different error sources so that you can see, when I do this, what's happening to this error source. And so looking for these unintended consequences, looking for these interaction effects, and that's where I think is the value of the dashboard, but it also having the visual aid is very powerful, and clients love that, by the way. We have clients who are really spending a lot of time looking at these visuals and learning a lot that they wouldn't learn if they were only looking at numbers in a table. So you want these metrics, of course, to be meaningful. You want them to be a few that are very, very closely correlated with the objectives of your survey. So if your objective of your survey is to get a balanced sample, then the metric should reflect the balancing. If it's to increase response rate, the metric should look at the response rate. In the studies that I'm doing, we have certain quotas that we have to get for different subgroups of the population. So, you have different age groups. In this particular case, we also have different other characteristics that we're trying to make sure that we have a certain number of sample members in each of these groups. And so that's the main objective. That's one of the main objectives for that survey. And so we have visualizations that actually look at the current sample distribution against the population distribution or against the target distribution that we're trying to achieve. And that tells us where we're short and what we need to do in order to be able to increase these numbers, or we're going to close off these subgroups because we have enough of them and we're going to concentrate on these subgroups. So that's what these metrics need to be doing. I also mentioned here that, they can be weighted or they can be unweighted. There are also indicators of measurement error, and we use a system that RTI developed called computer audio recorded interviewing, which basically is pretty common now, but it's basically when you're doing a CAPI interview, the computer that's used for CAPI is actually recording the interview, and it can be then uploaded along with the data, and we use it just like we were monitoring in a centralized telephone facility. We monitor these carry files and look for evidence of interviewer not following the guidelines, leading the respondent, skipping questions, or even complete fabrications. And so we can develop metrics for the carry that actually show us how interviewers are performing and get a snapshot of what the interviewer error is for our survey through these metrics. Now, the quality of these paradata can be suspect. For example, interviewers in the field are notorious for not recording all of their visits. So if you're trying to base some decision rule on how many callbacks that you are making to a particular household, you might find that the callbacks are inaccurate, and they can be severely inaccurate, because interviewers sometimes will not record the callbacks either because they're too busy, they forget about it, or intentionally, because they think they almost have this household and they know that the limit on the number of callbacks is 7, and they're already at the 7th one, but they think if they had another callback, they could actually get this person to respond, and that would look better on their record to have a response, and so they don't record it. So there are that kinds of things going on in the field that we have to be aware of, that these data are not always accurate. Even carry recordings can be manipulated because they can have a friend sit in as a respondent and conduct the entire interview, and its whole thing is recorded, looks authentic, but it's basically not the right respondent. So one has to realize that the paradata that we're getting is not always accurate. So it always helps to have multiple views, and if you see some of these metrics, multiple metrics that are measuring more or less the same thing, and if there's some discrepancy, that could be an indicator of something going awry. Bias and bias risk indicators. Response rate is the old favorite of a risk indicator for non-response bias. Of course, we have more sophisticated measures now, like the R indicator, the balance indicators, Mahalanobis distance. And then there's one that Andy and I came up with, which is this bias effect size. Basically, what you're looking at is, and again, you can do this on X variables if you don't have the Y's. I use Y here, but think of it in terms of the auxiliary information that one can use here. So you have the mean of the respondents and the mean of the non-respondents. That's what Y bar R and Y bar NR stand for, respondents and non-respondents. And then basically you're looking at that over the standard deviation of the Y, which is the definition of an effect size. So Cohen's effect size is essentially what you're looking at here. And in fact, you can actually use Cohen's effect size to measure whether you've got a small, medium, or large bias going on in your particular sample. So that's just an idea. Again, we need more indicators, not fewer indicators. We need more indicators because each indicator has sort of different characteristics and will show you different things. Now here is the bias indicator that has been plotted here, where the bubble reflects the variation in the BS, and this is using the Groves and Pacheva data that I showed you earlier. And you can see here that for low non-response rates, I'm wondering whether that should be, yeah. I think that should be, yeah, that's right. I think that should be response rates, in fact. But anyway, the idea is here that there is a trend you can see here. The larger bubbles for the lower values and the smaller bubbles for the higher values here. So again, there is some evidence using this particular metric of a variation going on depending upon the response rate. Larger effect sizes occur for lower non-response. Okay, this tells you the story. Larger effect sizes occur for lower non-response rates. Respondents and non-respondents tend to differ more when the non-response rates are low. Why is that? Why do we see bigger differences between respondents and non-respondents when the response rates are low? That's kind of counterintuitive, and it kind of threw me. But the reason is because the higher the response rate, you can think of it as the more different those non-respondents are from the people that you got. So the non-respondents tend to become more and more different the higher the response rate is. Pretty soon, you're at a group of people who are very, very special. So they are very, very different in their characteristics. That's something to keep in mind about the response rate, is that you could still have a bias even though the response rate is high, because that non-respondent group can be very, very different. But there is a limit, of course. So we need better methods for estimating these, and I give you some additional information there for things that you can do to increase or reduce, convert non-respondents, for example. And then there's some new methods here that I find very interesting. This paper by Little, West, Boonstra, and Hugh, for example, they basically took this idea that we had for the bias effect size and they formalized it, and it's now being published, and they call this the standardized measure of unadjusted bias, or SMUB metric, but it's based upon this idea of looking at the effective size. And then this paper by Ming is one that I highly recommend in terms of looking at the mean squared error. And a lot of times, you know, we're dealing with not sampling data. It's not a probability sample. It could be a census, could be administrative data, or it could be a non-probability sample because it's some big data set. And Ming's paper in 2018, this is a recent paper, provides some very good metrics for looking at mean squared error and bias for non-probability samples, which I find is very intriguing and something that, again, we would need in our art designs eventually, if not now. So what are some real-time interventions to improve data quality? So what are some things that we can do during data collection, and also, you know, maybe even in the design, but what are some things we can do to try to improve data quality? And this could be for increasing the response rate or sample balance. It could be reducing measurement error, reducing sampling error, or reducing frame error. So all of these things, we need to think in terms of error, the total error. And there are other error components, for example, data processing error I hadn't talked about. But these are the main ones I think we would like to control. We'd like to control the non-response bias, which is increasing the rows, or somehow using methodologies that would allow us to balance the sample better, level out the rows, or increase response rates. When it comes to reducing measurement error, again, a lot of research needs to be done there. We're very limited on the number of methods. I think Carrie has been a great innovation for interviewer-assisted interviews, but then that doesn't help you much for self-administered interviews because Carrie works on a recording, right? So there's nothing going on in a self-administered interview. So what are some metrics that one can use for, say, a web survey or a mail survey that would be available to reflect the measurement error? And we're doing a survey, or we have done a survey of energy consumption for households, where one of the variables we're collecting, and this is an online survey, is square footage. And there are administrative records which have square footage available for particular housing units. It's not very good data, however. It's not always the most current data. But nevertheless, it could be that a metric could be developed to look at what's recorded for what the respondent records for their square footage and what was on the record. And if there's a big discrepancy, that could be an indicator. Or if there tends to be larger discrepancies, then that could be an indication of high measurement error. Maybe people aren't understanding exactly what square footage we're looking at, because there's lots of different ways of defining the square footage of a household. and maybe respondents aren't getting it and are giving us a square footage which doesn't comply with our definition. So there are things like that that are being experimented with, but there needs to be more research in that area. Sampling error as well, there's a few things that are being done there to integrate administrative data to try to increase sample size, reduce design effects, those kinds of things. And then the frame error. So all of these things are important error sources, and when we talk about adaptive design, responsive design, or tailored designs, it shouldn't always be about response, non-response, and cost. But we also need to think in terms of the total error, because, like I say, you could be doing something very good to increase or reduce non-response bias, but it risks other error sources. Then total survey error monitoring in real time is really where it comes down to, trying to look at these interaction effects and these unintended consequences of what you're doing with your adaptive designs and trying to affect some sort of objective, to try to achieve some sort of objective. I think one objective would be that I achieve this objective without, not to the detriment of the total quality of the survey, but I maintain total quality while I'm achieving this particular objective. And I list some bullets there that would give you some idea of what we have been doing and research that's going on that I've already mentioned here. And then metrics to simultaneously monitor multiple error sources. There again, some suggestions for future research. Finally, we come to the eighth, which is post-survey statistical adjustment. So after all of our efforts, and I think Young mentioned yesterday that, that the adaptive design is a way of trying to control these biases in the design stage and actually the implementation stage. But failing that, or maybe not being 100% successful with that, we end up with a sample then that there's still some options to be able to improve the quality through some sort of adjustments, so post-survey statistical adjustments. And I think there needs to be some research there. Again, methods that we're using are somewhat antiquated, and there have been some new developments. For example, this weighting method by Singh, it's not that recent. I think that's about 10 years old or more. But he and his colleagues came up with this method for trying to control the unequal weighting effects when you have a two-phase sample, so you don't get, this dramatic increase in weights for the second phase respondents. There's been some work looking at abbreviated questionnaires that COT has done, for example, rather than go back to the non-respondents and get, one of the things that Gabby was talking about is what kind of protocol change. Once you have sort of exhausted the main data collection, call that phase one, if you will, the main data collection, and if you reached what she called the phase capacity, then you switch to another thing, which is supposed to be an improved protocol. So this protocol didn't work on some people. What you switch to has some promise of working on those people that the first protocol didn't work on. What is that? What is that second protocol? Well, it might be, you wouldn't fill out the 30-minute questionnaire. Would you fill out the 2-minute questionnaire? So 2 minutes of questions or 5 minutes of questions. And then what do you do with that? Well, one of the things you can do with that, if you choose the items carefully, it can reflect the bias in the entire sample. So you know something about the non-respondents based upon that 2-page or whatever questionnaire. But the other thing you can do if you chose those variables, those questions carefully, is you can use that to adjust in the non-response adjustment process, and that's what COT's method does. He uses this abbreviated questionnaire. So you got 50% with the standard mail web protocol using the Dillman method, and then you can add another 10, 15 points to that by going back to those same respondents and getting them to do a 2-pager. Now that 2-pager doesn't help you much in terms of being able to create a larger data set, but it does help you in the adjustment process, or can, I guess, depending upon whether or not you've chosen your variables properly. So here's my final slide, and where I think more research is necessary. I think we need effective real-time interventions to mitigate non-response and measurement error. So I think measurement errors is just as important as non-response. In fact, I've spent most of my career looking at measurement error, and I can tell you that from what I've seen, measurement error can be more damaging than non-response bias, measurement bias can. So, but we need to be able to measure it, so we have to have some way of measuring, some metrics that would reflect it, what's happening with the measurement error, and then some intervention strategies that if we don't like what's happening, we can get in there and change it before the data collection is ended, and it's too late to do that. And of course, there's all these issues about trying to change the questionnaire in midstream and so forth, and you don't have comparable data. If you go in and change that question in the middle of a survey, then that data is not comparable with this data. And so you have all those issues that we don't know the answers to yet. But if you find that a question isn't working, what are the strategies one can use to then intervene? Practical, effective methods for separating common and special cause variation, because I think this is very important. From what I've seen, and this is in staff that have many years of experience working in field work misinterpret variation. They know all about data collection from whatever mode you want to use, and they're very knowledgeable about surveys, but they still are, when they look at response rates over time, they still are thinking that this change, say this response rate dropped by 3 points for this particular interviewer, that interviewer needs to be retrained or contacted about that, and there's a problem there. No, that's just random variation, because after all, she's working or he's working a random sample. So why wouldn't there be random variation? But detecting whether it's random, a common cause or special cause is an important issue, but not much is being done. Better indicators, especially for measurement errors, I've already kind of beat that to death. And then finally, where I think a lot of the pushback comes when trying to use these methodologies, adaptive, responsive, and tailored design, is that, for one, we don't have staff that are well trained in these methods. They don't know how to do it very well. And you can see that some of these methods are fairly sophisticated, and we don't employ a lot of field staff that have master's degrees in survey methodology. They're a rare commodity. They're very good staff members, but they don't have the training necessarily. So we have to somehow simplify the methods for them or make it more automated. The other thing is sometimes we just don't have the infrastructure, because to be able to collect these paradata, have them bring them into the in-house, develop the metrics, plot those metrics, or somehow use a visualization approach or even tables to be able to then reflect what's happening in the metrics and then project them out to what's going to happen in the future. All of that infrastructure isn't there in a lot of cases. And I would say that all of the surveys at RTI use some measure of adaptive design, just like we used adaptive design back in the 70s and the 80s. But it's not, I wouldn't say they're all using sophisticated methodology, because that requires software, that requires training. There's an infrastructure that's missing. And I think that's what's holding us back in a lot of areas. And I'll stop here and see what comments or questions I've raised. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It was really a very intensive and very illuminating talk. You must agree with me. To me, I teach the sampling methods in a basic level, and I'm only in charge of the sampling design, but only the sampling errors. And I'm now very aware of how important is the non-sampling errors. And I think we have a coffee time afterwards, so I'll finish very soon and ask you some questions, so we can still take 10 minutes more after the 11 o'clock. So, because I'm sure there will be questions. It has been really a lecture for me, as I said, and I'll take much of what you say to my lectures, and thank you very much for that. It came to my mind some rings, like about the balance designs, that it came a reference of TJ, perhaps is the one or perhaps it's not. And only a comment that a lot of these adaptive designs and responsive designs are very much in need in this country. Some time ago, someone asked me about some designs I was collaborating. I'm full-time in academia, but from time to time ago. And they were complaining about how difficult it was to collect information, particularly in Guerrero and in some very rough areas. And it was a problem. And then after I saw the estimators and everything and the numbers, and I said, and where is the non-response? You have a very high response, at least the one you are reporting. They said, because we substitute the thing. And now I learned that it's very common to substitute primary sampling units. Up to there, it's fine. But if these adaptive designs are very useful and very important, because we are not only talking about non-sampling errors, but also everybody has heard in the newspapers that sometimes those collecting the information are in danger, in real danger. And so if they detect that on the surveys, they should actually change, they should monitor, and they should change the strategy or whatever they are doing, because the problem is serious. So I'm now aware of how important it is to use these adaptive and responsive designs, not only from the methodological point of view, but also from the security reasons in this country. And this is only one example, but there must be plenty, I'm sure. So it is important. So now please, questions to comments, suggestions, and anything. If we go one by one, Martin, then Emilio, and then if anyone, please raise.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, that's a very good question, Martin. Let me try to address that this way. So, yes, most of the time we don't know what the whys are. So we build these propensity models. Let's say it's a response propensity. So we're trying to look at the probability that an individual will respond, and that's, again, can be partly the contact. They can be contacted, and then the other part they cooperate given they're being contacted, and we don't. And say we're collecting income information. It's some sort of income survey. We don't know their income, okay? But we may have some clues about what their income is. So their non-response might be related. So low-income people may not respond as much as middle income, and then high-income people may not respond as well as middle-income people. So we know that somehow the response is related to income, but are there other characteristics that are correlated with income that could tell us something about what their income is, so that we see that the sample is not balanced with regard to low, middle, and high income people, but we balance it maybe on some other variable. For example, it could be the condition of the neighborhood that we might be able to obtain information from, maybe from Google Maps or something like that. Or maybe from census data, we have some idea of what it is at a certain aggregate level. Census isn't going to tell us what it is for an individual, but they will tell us what it is for maybe a combined block group or something like that. So we say these groups are high income, these groups are low income. Let's try to balance the sample that way. That's a very simplistic example. But if you don't have X variables that are very highly correlated with the Y's, which was my point, in that we're using X variables which are usually just convenient. They may be demographic variables, age, race, sex, those kinds of variables. And it's true that a lot of things could be correlated with age, race, and sex. And so if we balance the sample on age, race, and sex, maybe that'll be good for some items, but it won't be good for other items that don't rely on age, race, and sex. So that balancing has no effect at all on reducing the bias for those other Y variables. And so that's one of the reasons why, they're looking at the Y variables as they're collecting data. You heard Gabby talk about, they're plotting some Y variables then from the questionnaire just on the respondents they got so far. So they can see, for the respondents they have so far, they can see the Ys are changing, and then they level off. And they say, well, the Ys aren't changing anymore, so we're getting a new sample in here, but it seems like it's not changing the mean. The mean Y value is staying the same. And so the idea is that, could we do something different? So that's kind of like a phase capacity. When you don't see that change anymore, you say, well, we're done with this phase. It's not working anymore, so we got to do something else. What would that something else be? Well, maybe what you were doing is a web survey, and you're sort of tracking responses based on a web survey. So now you say, okay, let's take a sample of anyone who's not responded. They've reached phase capacity, and let's just go out there and knock on doors and see if we can get them. So that mode change could boost response rate. And then you might see, okay, the Y variable was tailing off. Now when you get this new protocol, you see a jump, and it changed the mean of the Y. So what does that mean? Does that mean we're getting closer to the truth? I don't think so. I don't know. I mean, maybe it could be that, or maybe it could be, though, that you're just getting people who are a lot different. Doesn't necessarily mean you're reducing bias. So that's the problem I have with that kind of methodology. There's not really a good solution when you don't have the Ys, and if you don't have good X's, you can plot the Ys and look at the sample over time, and then you can do something to change the slope of that Y curve, but you never really know unless you have some external information, which is the gold standard. You really never know whether you're getting closer to the truth or you're just changing the mean.
Hi, my name is Emilio, and again, thank for the invaluable talk. It was cool. In this historical account of the art sampling designs, is there a proposed strategy to address this complete stratum focalized 100% total non-response, I mean refusals? And for this I have two real examples in Mexico. Let's say that there is a complete big and relevant state in Mexico which does not want to participate in the survey, but the survey has the aim to be to produce national estimates, and it is sort of a organized non-response, or like the whole stratum does not want to participate. And there is another real example. Let's say there's a complete population stratum of extremely high income does not want to respond any question of the survey, any. And again, there is the official mandate of provide national estimates of the income. Maybe this is kind of, it is not organized, but it is like automatic non-response, like you cannot enter this specific stratum not by web sampling or nothing. It's just impenetrable. Is there any strategy proposed in this historical account? Or maybe it is not a problem of adaptive survey design or responsive. Maybe it is a problem of a mixture between coverage, non-response, measurement error. I don't know.
No, I thank you very much for your question. It's a very good question. And I think that the answer is there are methods that have been used successfully under certain circumstances. For example, let me give you a situation where it would work. What I'm talking about would work. So, let's say in a foreign trade survey, they have a cutoff in terms of the size of the establishment. If an establishment or an enterprise is above this cutoff, they're going to select them for the sample and get information. Below the cutoff, they're not going to sample them. So they have a zero probability of responding because they're not even sampled, right? So that's kind of a stratum you can think about as a stratum that has a zero probability of responding. But unfortunately they have some models that they've developed based upon the size and other characteristics of the establishment, their industry, and all these things that can do a pretty good job of estimating that aggregate. Not necessarily the individual foreign trade imports and exports, but for the aggregate, they can do a pretty good job, and so they can still get an aggregate measure. So that's a situation where it works pretty well. Now you can have another situation, for example, you have a survey and you have a large sample in Arizona, New Mexico, and they're fall to Indian reservations, and the Indian reservations, they don't want to respond. So you're not going to get any response from the Indian reservations. Now, there, rather than a statistical adjustment, there could be a methodology where you try to talk to the tribal leaders and so forth and gain cooperation and get them to help you estimate or maybe even do some interviewing within the reservation to try to get information like that. If it's an important segment of your estimate, in other words, if it carries some fairly substantial weight in your estimate, it is important to do that. In some cases, we don't worry about it because we take a national sample, there's such a small part of the sample, you know, it's not going to matter much bias. So you could have a situation where the bias doesn't matter. You could have the situation where the bias is important, and you can do something in the sort of the data collection. But if you can't do it in the data collection, they still won't cooperate. How do you model that? That's the only thing left that I know. You know, you'd have to have a pretty good model. Maybe you have some other reservations that are cooperating, and then some reservations are not, and maybe you can use that information to model the other. So that's the situation where you have to resort to a model, and who knows how well that'll work.
The web collection is a non-probability sampling collection. So here is the problem: they combine non-sampling probabilities with a probabilistic sampling.
Yeah, well, now I might not have made myself clear, but if we do a say web survey, I was talking about a web survey where we did say we got a 50% response rate on the web survey, and then half of our sample didn't participate. We might take a random sample of that 50%, say take a third of the non-respondents, and then send them to the field and knock on doors and get the information that way, because they wouldn't respond for the web, but they might. We might get, you know, maybe out of that 33% of the sample that we select, we might get maybe 30-40% of them to respond. So that would be a good deal, because then we'd have that information and we could model the non-response bias. Okay, but if you're talking about trying to combine a probability sample with a non-probability sample, that's still being discussed and trying to figure out how to actually do that these days. And some of that, I know that there are some methods called, have you ever heard of fusion, data fusion? So that's a method for kind of merging information from a non-probability sample onto a probability sample based upon characteristics which are similar. So you have a probability sample over here and you have a non-probability sample over here, but it turns out that both samples have some common characteristics. And if you're lucky, those common characteristics satisfy the assumptions to where if you match on those common characteristics, you can take the data from this sample and merge it onto the probability sample. Or you could take the data from the probability sample and merge it on, you know, you can do the merging, fusion in both ways. So that's some of the methods that are being worked on. But and also you can, I know that a company I work for that did a lot of marketing, they would actually develop, they have a probability sample and they have a table and they have the table's defined by characteristics, age, race, and sex, for example, if I use that again. And then they have this non-probability sample over here that if it happens to have age, race, and sex, what they'll do is they'll take people of the same age, race, and sex, and they'll just plug it into that cell along with the probability sample and then weight it all together. Now, there are some assumptions being made. That's kind of like a fusion. There are assumptions that's being made there that may not be satisfied, but under certain assumptions, you can get away with that. Thank you. Thank you.